I understand what Matthew is doing in his gospel, even if it isn't historically what happened to Jesus and his family, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We get a couple different versions of Jesus' birth story. Matthew is writing for a Jewish audience, and at the outset of his gospel, he wants them to understand who Jesus is, that he is the new Moses, a savior, a liberator who will bring his people out of oppression and deliver them to a new promised land. And so we hear at the beginnings of Jesus' story in Matthew echoes of Moses' story. When fearful, insecure King Herod starts murdering all the babies in Bethlehem, we hear echoes, don't we, of insecure, fearful Herod killing all the Hebrew babies in Egypt. When Jesus and his family run for their lives as refugees to Egypt, we hear echoes, don't we, of the Hebrew people fleeing from Egypt to escape exploitation and violence. But the truth is, as much as Matthew's aim was for the Jewish people to hear echoes of their sacred stories, they aren't the only ones who hear echoes, right? We all do. We know this story, don't we? Because this human story of violence, it has been reverberating through humanity for a very long time. That story happens whenever fearful people choose to let their fears ring louder than their compassion. It happens whenever privileged, powerful people grow insecure and they choose to use their power to greedily hoard and protect their privilege rather than protecting the vulnerable among us. That story happens whenever people prop up corrupt, oppressive power structures simply because they benefit them, rather than tearing down what hurts their neighbors. Whenever that happens, humanity creates oppressive conditions where atrocities can occur and people get displaced from their homes. We create the conditions where people must run from violence threatening their lives, must leave their home just to exist in freedom and peace, must seek refuge across borders to protect their children. We hear that story, right, echoed across the globe right now. We hear it in those epicenters of violence where people have been displaced, sometimes by the millions. We hear it in Ukraine, in South Sudan, in Niger, in Syria, and yes, even in that exact same spot where the violence occurs in our biblical story in the streets of Palestine right now. But of course, we also hear those echoes even closer to home, don't we? We hear it along our own southern border as desperate families show up seeking sanctuary from organized crime or gang violence or drug wars in Central America. Any of you read the news or watch the news this morning? Just this morning, a woman and 2 children tried to cross the Rio Grande. And again on the news, we hear of an insecure, fearful leader acting on fear instead of compassion. The governor sent the Texas military without clear instructions how they were to proceed or what they were to do. They ended up blocking Border Patrol agents from reaching the boat ramp where they could have launched a boat to go aid this family. The woman and her children drowned. Can you imagine if Jesus and his parents had been blocked in such a way as they fled to Egypt? Can you imagine? So yes, we hear echoes of that violent human story close to home. We hear it in the cry of immigrants and refugees and drowning children. We also hear it in the cries of women without control over their own bodies, having to flee across state borders to seek the care they need. We hear it in people of color being terrorized by white supremacists and state-sanctioned violence. We hear it in the cries of transgender children taking their own lives because people feel so threatened by their existence that they try to erase it in libraries and curriculum. They threaten doctors and parents who try to care for them. We hear it in the cries of children terrified to go to school because in this era where we have a pandemic of gun violence, gun owners have decided they feel more threatened by having checks placed on gun ownership than children's lives. And yes, we hear it in refugee and immigrant families, as I said. We hear it in the ones who are showing up at our borders, who are seeking compassion, and who are instead getting ripped apart from each other by our fears and our insecurities. 2,000 years separates us from King Herod, even more from Pharaoh. And yet not much has changed. Fears and insecurities and desperate attempts to hold onto power and privilege, excuse me, they are still manifesting, aren't they? They're manifesting as violence and terror in our own world. And they're doing so in such, excuse me, there's cough drops right back there in the AV booth, thank you. Sorry folks, the air is dry and cold today. Makes a difference. Thank you. Excuse me, everyone. Fears, insecurities, and desperate attempts to hold on to power and privilege, they're still manifesting as violence and terror in our own world, and they're doing so in such evil ways that people must leave their homes, must go on the run, must cross borders and plead with foreign strangers for compassion and refuge and safety. I don't know if Matthew knew that would be the case. I imagined he hoped that it would be much different in our world 2,000 years after Jesus showed us the way of peace. But as he writes his gospel, the context that he sets for Jesus' birth and for the struggles that Jesus and his fledgling family have to face, they seem as real and plausible today as they did then. Someone in our congregation recently, vulnerably and very honestly, shared with me about their own struggles of faith. They said, I hear you talking about all these biblical stories, and I see how God was showing up then, but I don't see where God is today. So much is going wrong in our world. They said, I'm just struggling to believe that everything's actually going to work out. I don't think that member of our congregation is alone in that sentiment, are they? Here's the thing. I don't think people in Jesus' time could see where God was either. When Herod was killing all those babies, when Rome came and occupied their land and was so overtaxing people that people were becoming homeless, losing land that had been in their families for generations, when all that was going on, I doubt very much whether the vast majority of people could see God at work among them. And the question for them, as for us today, is how do you find faith when you can't see God? I had attended a friend of mine, he was being installed at Church of the Isles as their new pastor this morning. And the preacher was talking about that basic human need we all have to see in order to believe, to try it before we buy it, if you will. It's so incredibly hard to believe in something that we can't see, isn't it? So what do we do when we look around us, friends, and all we see is that same old story of violence playing out again and again, displacing people from their homes? One of the themes that features prominently in Matthew's story of Jesus' birth and early life is the theme of dreams. In a time and place of incredible violence and oppression that was displacing enormous numbers of people, Matthew's Christmas story, it talks about dreams. It talks about these divine glimpses that these characters get of God in their midst. And these dreams, they let these characters see just enough of God that they can believe that a new reality is coming, is possible. And by faith, they're able to step into that new reality. We hear, of course, of the dreams of those astrologers. Remember, they're warned in a dream not to return to King Herod and tell him where to find this child. We also hear of the dreams of Joseph. And you might recall, Joseph is not the first dreamer named Joseph in the Bible. Another Joseph, much earlier, once turned a story of unspeakable brotherly violence into a story of refuge, redemption, thriving, and abundance. And he did so by dreaming, with God's help, into a new reality. Through his dreams, he transforms not only his reality and saves himself, but he saves his whole family, including those brothers who did him wrong, and even a whole other country of foreigners who had once enslaved him. Everyone is lifted up when he dreams and catches that glimpse of God. And now in our story today, we hear of another Joseph. And he too dreams his way into a new future for him and for his family. And it too, through Jesus, it ends up lifting up all of us, the whole world round. Because of how prominently dreams feature in Matthew's version of the Christmas story, dreams have been on my mind a lot lately. And interestingly, I've had a number of pretty powerful dreams recently, and they've been dreams about our church, our congregation, and all this change and transition we've been through, and dreams about where we're going together, how we're going to make a way forward together. You know, at night, when our bodies go to sleep, that's the time when our minds start processing all of the worries and the fears and the anxieties that have been kicked up during our waking hours. At night, that's when we work on solutions to our problems in our dreams. And sometimes, when we're sleeping, we're able to be a little more creative and get past some of the blocks that are there during our waking hours. Sometimes in our dreams, we see how things can be different and how we can be part of making a new reality. In Matthew's version of Jesus' birth story, that is how and when God shows up. Joseph, troubled and anxious about his fiancée being pregnant with someone else's baby and what people will say, planning to quietly break off their engagement, he goes to sleep. And in his dreams, God shows him another way. The astrologers from the east, confused and anxious about Herod's intention, about what will happen if they return to Herod, they go to sleep, and in their dreams, God shows them another way. Joseph, anxious about the violence of King Herod and their Roman occupiers, he goes to sleep, and God shows him another way for him and his family. Now, had any of these characters dismissed their dreams as nothing more than dreams and not followed that alternate way that God gave them in their dreams, we wouldn't have the story of Jesus passed down to us today. As I said, those dreams, they gave them just enough seeing for them to believe and live into a different future. Now, maybe it sounds too new age, too woo-woo, to talk about dreams in church. But lately, friends, I've been wondering if we need to listen to our dreams more. If we need to let them show us a glimpse of God. When we cannot see God in the world around us, maybe we need to let our dreams show us a glimpse so that we too can believe and find that alternate way home, not just for ourselves, but for all of humanity. It's not lost on me that for a brief time, when we decided in this country that we could make a way for kids who, like Jesus, were carried across borders as children by parents trying to protect them, we called those kids what? Dreamers. I don't know if Matthew intended or not, but when he shows us Jesus and his family fleeing to Egypt, he helps us to see Jesus and his parents in the most vulnerable people around us today, in refugees, in people without home or country who are seeking sanctuary. Jesus was a refugee. Jesus was a refugee, and it's through the dreams and bravery of his parents, as well as the compassion and hospitality of foreigners and strangers, that Jesus' story finds a future, that the story of love among us finds a future. Perhaps, friends, when we are struggling to see where God is around us today, we too need to listen to the dreams and the bravery of the refugees among us, and the stories of compassion and hospitality of the strangers that show them a welcome. Perhaps then we too will see God's story of love finding a future among us.